Inside a standard, dust-covered cardboard box in a suburban Utah garage, wrapped in old towels and sealed with heavy packing tape, lay a secret that defied human biology and maternal instinct. For 10 years, a mother managed to give birth to 7 healthy infants in total isolation, only to systematically end their lives the moment they drew their first breath. She didn't flee, she didn't hide the evidence across state lines, and she didn't change her identity. Instead, she placed the remains into separate storage containers and lived just a few feet away from them, continuing her daily routine as if the garage held nothing more than forgotten holiday decorations. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand how a domestic garage in a quiet Utah suburb became a multi-year burial ground, one must examine the specific social geography of Pleasant Grove and the fractured reality of the woman at the center of the horror. Nestled against the rugged slopes of the Wasatch Range, Pleasant Grove was a community deeply rooted in traditional family structures, religious cohesion, and an outward expectation of wholesome domesticity. In this environment, hyper-vigilant neighbors kept immaculate lawns, church attendance was a social baseline, and large families were celebrated. It was the last place anyone would look for a systemic anomaly. Yet the insular nature of the community simultaneously created a perfect screen for extreme isolation. Megan Huntsman lived in a modest home owned by her parents on East 200 South, a property that looked entirely indistinguishable from the neighboring residences, complete with a cluttered but ostensibly normal driveway and garage. Born in 1975, Huntsman grew up within this culture, but gradually drifted into its deepest, darkest margins. Those who interacted with her during her 20s and early 30s described a woman who was physically present but emotionally vacant. A quiet, almost ghost-like figure who mastered the art of being unmemorable. She was small in stature, frequently wearing oversized, loose-fitting clothing that became a permanent fixture of her wardrobe. To the outside world, she was a mother raising 3 daughters. She walked them to the local park, attended occasional neighborhood gatherings, and took on sporadic, low-wage jobs, including working at a local manufacturing plant and babysitting for families in the area. Neighbors noted that she was exceptionally quiet, rarely initiating conversation, but she was never viewed as a threat. She was trusted with other people's children, maintaining a fragile veneer of baseline competence that kept the state's Division of Child and Family Services completely away from her door. Behind this mundane facade lay a severe, rapidly escalating addiction that consumed every financial resource and cognitive function Huntsman possessed. By the late 1990s, she had become heavily dependent on methamphetamine. The drug took absolute priority over her reality, warping her judgment and hollowing out her emotional capacity. In a community where substance abuse was heavily stigmatized and viewed as a moral failure, her addiction had to remain completely subterranean. Huntsman became a master of compartmentalization, occupying 2 distinct universes simultaneously. In one, she was the muted, dependable mother navigating the suburban landscape of Pleasant Grove. In the other, she was a severe addict, operating in a state of perpetual chemical survival, driven by a profound panic that her secret life would be exposed, stripping away her housing, her children, and her remaining social standing. Her long-term partner and husband, Darren West, shared this turbulent subculture of addiction, but lacked her ability to remain under the radar. The domestic environment on East 200 South was volatile, defined by erratic financial strain, constant substance use, and a complete breakdown of healthy communication. Yet despite the chaos of their shared drug use, a profound emotional chasm existed between the two. They operated as parallel entities under the same roof, bound by habit and shared vices rather than genuine intimacy. While West's legal troubles began to mount, drawing the attention of federal law enforcement due to his involvement in meth distribution networks, Huntsman managed to fade further into the background. She learned to minimize her footprint, ensuring that even as her home life deteriorated into a haze of chemical dependency and paranoia, the external perception of her household remained just orderly enough to avoid official intervention. This deliberate cultivation of obscurity allowed an unfathomable routine to establish itself within the home, completely unnoticed by her growing daughters, her extended family, and the neighbors who lived just feet away. The relationship between Megan Huntsman and Darren West was forged in the early 1990s within the specific insular geography of Utah County, a region where rapid suburban sprawl intersected with a hidden underground drug subculture. To outward appearances, the couple represented a standard blue-collar pairing typical of the area. They had met during their late teens, a period when both were drifting away from the strict religious and social expectations of their upbringing. West was known in his immediate circle as an assertive, somewhat reckless individual who frequently sought out high-risk environments, while Huntsman was remembered as a highly malleable, quiet figure who easily dissolved into the background of whoever she was with. By the mid-1990s, they had established a permanent domestic partnership, eventually marrying and moving into the home on East 200 South in Pleasant Grove. To family members, they seemed committed to building a life together, welcoming 3 daughters into the world over the next decade. These children grew up in a household that appeared, from the street, to be entirely stable. Beneath that veneer, the structural foundation of their partnership was completely hollowed out by a shared dependency on illicit substances, specifically methamphetamine. The drug served as both the primary bond between them and the architect of their profound isolation. As the years progressed, their daily lives became entirely transactional, dictated by the logistical demands of maintaining a constant chemical supply. West shifted from a mere consumer of the drug into an active participant in local distribution networks, a choice that introduced an undercurrent of paranoia and volatility into the residence. Yet the most critical dynamic of their relationship was not the shared criminality, but the total breakdown of genuine interpersonal awareness. They existed as domestic ghosts under the same roof. West was frequently absent, consumed by his illicit business ventures and late-night associations, while Huntsman withdrew deeper into a state of perpetual intoxication. Her severe addiction created a highly specific form of psychological detachment. She became entirely non-communicative, executing her daily tasks as a mother with a mechanical, detached precision that left no room for emotional intimacy. This total absence of mutual observation explains how the core paradox of this household was allowed to manifest. Between 1996 and 2006, a period of exactly 10 years, the structural arrangement of their relationship enabled Huntsman to conceal an unimaginable secret. During these years, she became pregnant multiple times. Because her baseline physical appearance was small and she consistently favored heavily layered, baggy winter clothing, the physical transformations of these pregnancies remained entirely unremarked upon by West. In his later statements to investigators, he insisted that he never once suspected his wife was carrying his children during those specific intervals. This was not merely a failure of physical perception, but a testament to the profound emotional and psychological chasm that defined their marriage. The heavy cloud of methamphetamine use created a persistent state of cognitive fog and self-absorption for both parties. West was too focused on his own legal jeopardy and drug transactions to notice the subtle changes in his wife's body or behavior, while Huntsman operated with a calculated, silent determination to ensure that her pregnancies never disrupted the fragile domestic status quo that kept her addiction funded and hidden. The domestic environment during this decade became a masterclass in sinister camouflage. The couple managed to raise their 3 living daughters to school age, ensuring they were clothed, fed, and integrated into the local community. Relatives frequently visited the home, cooking meals in the kitchen and walking through the living areas without ever detecting a hint of the systemic darkness unfolding in the parallel reality Huntsman had constructed. West's presence in the home became increasingly sporadic as law enforcement began closing in on his distribution operations, a development that only intensified Huntsman's isolation. She was left entirely alone with her thoughts and her chemical dependency, viewing any potential addition to the family not as a human life, but as an existential threat to her survival mechanism. A new infant would mean mandatory medical intervention, visits from social workers, financial strain that would siphon money away from her drug supply, and the immediate exposure of her severe addiction to a community that would instantly cast her out. To prevent this collapse, she utilized the profound neglect within her relationship as a protective shield. She knew with absolute certainty that as long as she remained quiet, uncomplaining, and invisible, her husband would never look closely enough to see what was happening right in front of him. This mutual detachment became the ultimate enabling factor, setting the stage for a localized sequence of events that occurred entirely within the physical confines of a shared family home, completely unrecorded by the man who slept in the very same bed. The culmination of Megan Huntsman's secret timeline did not occur in a single explosive confrontation, but rather unfolds across a highly specific, repetitive sequence of physical actions that transpired between 1996 and 2006. The true incident in this case is not a solitary date. It is a decade-long clinical methodology executed entirely within the walls of the home on East 200 South. Each localized event followed an almost identical operational loop. Huntsman would go into labor completely unassisted, typically in the late night or early morning hours, while the rest of the household was asleep or absent. She did not call for medical assistance, nor did she utilize any standard prenatal resources. The births occurred on the floor of her bathroom or bedroom in absolute silence. The physical mechanics of these moments required a terrifying level of self-control and detachment. To prevent any sound from escaping the room and alerting her daughters or neighbors, Huntsman relied on the heavy, chemical-induced sedation of her methamphetamine use. The drug did not just fuel her paranoia, it provided a visceral numbing effect, allowing her to endure the intense physical trauma of childbirth without making an audible sound. The moment each infant emerged into the world, alive and breathing, Huntsman did not hesitate. There was no period of maternal contemplation, no shifting of intent. The process was immediate, mechanical, and entirely transactional. According to her subsequent admissions, she would immediately apply pressure to the infant's airway, using her bare hands or a piece of cloth to stop the breathing before the child could produce a first cry. In at least one instance, a small cord or strip of fabric was wrapped tightly around the neck to ensure asphyxiation. The sensory environment of these moments was defined by an immediate shift from the warmth of birth to the cold reality of concealment. Once the infant ceased to move, Huntsman did not panic or attempt to destroy the evidence. Her primary objective was preservation through total containment. She would immediately wrap the small body in whatever materials were readily available within the immediate domestic space: old bath towels, discarded t-shirts, sheets of plastic, or layers of heavy utility paper. She would then place the bundle inside a standard cardboard shoebox or a small shipping container. To prevent any biological decomposition from creating an odor that would compromise the household, she sealed every edge of the cardboard with multiple layers of heavy-duty packing tape, creating an airtight vacuum. The final step of the sequence involved moving the sealed box from the living space into the attached garage. The garage was not a remote storage locker. It was an active part of the daily family routine. It was cluttered with the standard artifacts of suburban life: broken lawnmowers, old holiday decorations, storage bins, and tools. Huntsman would navigate this space, placing the newly sealed box onto a shelf, or packing it deep into a corner behind larger items, ensuring it blended completely into the surrounding clutter. She would then return to the house, clean the birth site with standard household detergents, and resume her role as a mother, preparing breakfast for her living children, or walking them to school just hours later. This precise process was repeated 6 more times over the course of 10 years. The intervals between the births were marked by an absolute lack of intervention, because the garage remained cold during the Utah winters and dry during the summers. The sealed boxes functioned as primitive mummification chambers. The heavy layers of tape and plastic successfully contained the chemical byproducts of decay, preventing any noticeable scent from penetrating the shared walls of the residence. The living daughters played in the driveway, walked past the shelves to grab bicycles, and spent their childhoods inches away from a growing collection of sealed cardboard boxes, completely unaware that their mother had cataloged the remains of their siblings behind old paint cans and seasonal clothing bins. The final element of this prolonged timeline occurred in April 2014, when the physical reality of the garage was finally forced into the light. Darren West had been released from a federal correctional institution after serving a multi-year sentence for drug offenses. The relationship between the two had completely dissolved during his incarceration, and Huntsman had recently vacated the property, leaving behind decades of accumulated domestic refuse. West, along with several extended family members, arrived at the house with the sole intention of cleaning out the garage so the property could be prepared for sale or re-rental. The physical atmosphere on that spring morning was heavy with dust and the scent of stagnant air. West began moving large items from the shelves, working his way toward the back corners of the space. It was during this process that he encountered a specific cardboard box that felt unusually heavy and was wrapped in an excessive amount of degraded packing tape. Using a utility knife, he sliced through the old adhesive and pulled back the cardboard flaps. Inside, beneath a layer of stained towels, he discovered a tightly wrapped plastic bundle. The sensory anchor of this discovery was the immediate release of a sharp chemical odor that had been trapped for years. West cut into the inner plastic layer, expecting to find old car parts or discarded chemicals. Instead, he exposed a tiny, completely preserved human foot. The shock was instantaneous and physical. West dropped the box, retreated from the garage into the driveway, and immediately called the Pleasant Grove Police Department. The dispatcher received a call from a man who could barely articulate what he was looking at, repeating only that he had found something dead, wrapped in plastic inside his garage. When the first patrol officers arrived at East 200 South, they found West sitting on the curb, visibly shaken. The officers entered the garage with flashlights, expecting to find an abandoned animal or a medical specimen left behind by a previous tenant. They approached the opened box on the floor. As the beam of the flashlight illuminated the interior of the plastic wrapping, the responding officer confirmed the presence of an infant corpse. The scene was immediately frozen. The property was cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, and a call was placed to the Major Crimes Unit and the state medical examiner. The quiet suburban street was suddenly flooded with emergency vehicles, marking the end of the silent decade and the beginning of a forensic investigation that would completely shatter the community's perception of the house on East 200 South. The discovery of the first infant body instantly converted the suburban home from a chaotic storage clearing site into a restricted forensic grid. Within 30 minutes of the initial emergency call, the driveway on East 200 South was blocked by 4 patrol units, their strobe lights throwing rhythmic blue and red reflections against the aluminum garage door. The responding patrolmen, recognizing the profound biological anomaly inside the open cardboard box, did not attempt to alter or unpack the contents. They immediately withdrew, establishing a strict perimeter with yellow barrier tape that sealed off the entire front yard, the driveway, and the side alleys leading to the back of the property. The atmosphere in the immediate vicinity transformed. The casual weekend sounds of lawnmowers and neighborhood children were replaced by the heavy idling of unmarked police cruisers and the arrival of the Utah County Major Crimes Unit. By mid-afternoon, the state medical examiner's team arrived alongside a digital forensics unit and specialized technical investigators. The physical objective was clear but intensely meticulous. Every square inch of the garage had to be systematically cataloged, photographed, and cleared. The structure itself was a deep, disorganized space filled with decades of accumulated domestic debris, stacked plastic storage bins, discarded car parts, loose tools, old clothing, and seasonal decorations. Because the first body had been found inside a standard cardboard box hidden behind unrelated household refuse, the search team could not rely on visual inspection alone. Every object had to be moved, scanned, and cataloged. As investigators began the slow process of clearing the shelves, the operational focus shifted from a localized discovery to the identification of an intentional hidden system. Within hours, a second heavily taped cardboard box was located on an upper shelf, buried behind old paint cans. Then, a third. By the time the sun began to set over the Wasatch Range, forensic technicians had identified a total of 7 separate cardboard boxes that shared identical packaging characteristics. Each container was wrapped in multiple, degraded layers of heavy packing tape, electrical adhesive, or plastic wrap, designed to seal the biological contents from the outside environment. The physical retrieval of these boxes was executed with clinical precision. Technicians wearing full biohazard suits and double-layered nitrile gloves carefully lifted each sealed container from its resting place, transferring them directly to rigid, temperature-controlled evidence transport bins. The ambient air inside the garage remained thick with dust and the lingering synthetic scent of old automotive chemicals. But as each box was moved, the structural integrity of the seal was preserved to protect any latent trace evidence. Investigators noted that the containers had been placed in completely unexceptional locations. Some sat on open wire shelving alongside standard utility tools, while others were wedged into the dark spaces between old furniture and stacks of magazines. There was no specialized hidden compartment or locked vault. The collection was integrated entirely into the mundane topography of household junk. While the physical clearing of the garage was underway, a parallel tracking operation was launched to locate the former resident of the home. Megan Huntsman had left the property several months prior and was currently residing at a temporary location in a neighboring municipality. Her sudden departure, combined with the extreme nature of the evidence discovered in her family's garage, made her the primary person of interest. Detectives from the Pleasant Grove Police Department did not issue a public alert or utilize broadcast media for a widespread search, fearing that a high-profile pursuit might cause the suspect to flee or destroy additional evidence. Instead, they utilized silent electronic surveillance, tracking her known cellular footprint and monitoring the addresses of her immediate associates. The local social echo began to manifest long before the official police press conference. In a tight-knit community where neighbors shared property lines for decades, the sight of a full forensic extraction team operating under floodlights in the middle of a residential block triggered immediate, volatile rumors. Small groups of residents gathered at the edge of the police tape, watching technicians carry the uniform evidence bins from the garage to the state transport vans. The primary confusion centered on how an entire family, including 3 growing daughters and an extended network of relatives who frequently visited the home, could have coexisted with such a reality without a single drop of information leaking to the outside world. Rumors circulating through local phone trees suggested everything from a mass casualty event to a clandestine medical waste disposal site. The absolute silence from the police department during the first 12 hours of the operation only intensified the community's profound anxiety. Inside the secure environment of the Utah County Medical Examiner's facility, the forensic process entered its most difficult phase. The 7 sealed containers were placed inside a sterile isolation theater equipped with advanced ventilation systems to handle biological decomposition. One by one, forensic pathologists began the delicate process of slicing through the decades-old packing tape and plastic layers. Each incision had to be made with extreme care to avoid damaging the fragile skeletal and tissue structures inside. As the layers of cardboard and adhesive were peeled back, the internal contents revealed a consistent, horrifying pattern of preservation. Inside 6 of the boxes, pathologists uncovered the mummified, fragile remains of an infant. The dry, stable climate of the garage had slowed the standard process of decay, leaving skin textures, tiny bone structures, and hair patterns partially intact beneath the wrapped towels and utility paper. However, when the 7th box was opened, the biological findings differed significantly. The remains within this specific container showed clear signs of a full-term stillbirth, with medical indicators suggesting the infant had died in utero due to natural complications before any external intervention could occur. This critical distinction meant that while 7 bodies had been systematically packaged and concealed, the legal boundaries of the homicide investigation would focus strictly on the 6 infants who had entered the world alive. The conclusion of the initial search on East 200 South left the property completely hollowed out, its mundane garage converted into a permanently stigmatized landmark. The physical evidence was safely secured within state laboratories, and the electronic surveillance net was closing in on Huntsman's temporary residence. The investigation was about to transition from the silent containment of a crime scene to a direct psychological confrontation. as detectives prepared to bring the quiet mother out of the margins and into the interrogation room to answer the fundamental question of how a decade of human life could be reduced to a collection of sealed cardboard boxes. The physical containment of the house on East 200 South shifted the structural burden of the case entirely onto the interview rooms of the Pleasant Grove Police Department. Megan Huntsman was located at a nearby residence and brought into custody without physical resistance. The environment of the interrogation space was clinically sterile, a small, windowless room defined by a metal table, 2 recording devices, and the steady, low hum of the building's ventilation system. For the lead detectives, the primary tactical challenge was navigating the profound emotional flatlining of the woman sitting across from them. Huntsman did not exhibit the erratic, high-energy behavior typical of acute methamphetamine intoxication, nor did she display the visible panic of a suspect facing multiple counts of first-degree murder. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, her responses delivered in a flat, uninflected monotone that completely detached the linguistic reality of her words from the biological horror of the evidence. The initial phase of the interrogation focused on establishing the timeline of the pregnancies and the physical mechanics of the concealment. Detectives approached the questioning linearly, attempting to match the estimated ages of the mummified remains with specific calendar years. Huntsman did not attempt to fabricate an alibi or deny ownership of the sealed containers. Instead, she began a systematic chronological admission that left the investigators operating in a state of professional disbelief. She explained that during the 10-year window, she had viewed each impending birth not as a human transition, but as a logistical crisis that required immediate termination to protect her access to narcotics. Her internal logic was entirely survivalist. A newborn child would inevitably attract medical professionals, social services, and financial tracking, which would instantly expose her severe substance abuse to the community. To dissolve the defense's ability to claim a sudden, drug-induced psychotic break during a single event, detectives meticulously documented the repetitive nature of her actions. Huntsman described how she would monitor her own labor, waiting for intervals when the house was completely empty before delivering the infants on her bathroom floor. She admitted to utilizing her bare hands or strips of household cloth to cut off the airway of each child within seconds of delivery, confirming that she could hear them breathing before she applied the pressure. Pathologists at the state lab were simultaneously conducting X-ray scans on the mummified skeletal structures, looking for indicators of live birth, such as hydrostatic lung inflation, to corroborate her admissions. While Huntsman's confession provided the behavioral layout of the crimes, it simultaneously triggered a massive, complex tracking operation regarding potential co-conspirators. The primary red herring that consumed the first phase of the wider investigation centered on Darren West. Detectives found it mechanically difficult to accept that an adult male could reside in the same modest domestic space for a decade, engaging in an intimate relationship with a spouse, without ever noticing 7 distinct full-term pregnancies or the physical extraction of newborns. The investigation expanded to dissect West's entire history, his daily movements, and his communication logs from the drug distribution networks he had operated before his federal incarceration. For several weeks, the case stalled in a maze of structural dead ends. Search teams re-entered the residence on East 200 South with high-intensity alternative light sources, looking for blood tracking patterns, hidden medical documentation, or any physical indication that West had assisted in the cleanup or packaging of the containers. Investigators interviewed dozens of associates from the local drug trade, working under the hypothesis that the concealment was a mutual agreement to avoid drawing police attention to a high-volume drug house. West was subjected to multiple rounds of intensive polygraph examinations and detailed profiling by state behavioral analysts. The breakthrough that cleared this investigative bottleneck came from the State Forensic Laboratory's DNA profiling unit. Pathologists extracted viable genetic material from the deep bone tissue of the 6 mummified infants and compared the markers against reference samples provided by both Huntsman and West. The molecular data returned a definitive, unyielding result. West was indeed the biological father of all the infants. However, the subsequent forensic analysis of the packing materials, The tape adhesive and the unique fiber transfers found on the sealed containers showed zero indication of a second contributor. The physical prints and hair fragments recovered from the airtight seals belonged exclusively to Huntsman. Behavioral analysts concluded that the heavy, continuous cloud of methamphetamine production and consumption within the household had created a symbiotic state of extreme mutual neglect. West's cognitive functions were so entirely absorbed by his own criminal liabilities and substance-induced paranoia that he was functionally blind to the physical transformations occurring within his own bed. Outside the police facility, the social echo of the investigation had completely paralyzed the local community. Pleasant Grove was a town that built its identity on child safety and neighborly transparency, and the realization that a multi-year serial infanticide had occurred in plain sight caused a profound breakdown of social trust. Local media outlets maintained a 24-hour presence outside the police tape, while online forums were flooded with volatile speculation regarding the daughters who had grown up in the home. Rumors suggested that the surviving children must have been complicit, or that the extended family had deliberately covered up the crimes to protect the family's standing in the local church. The police department was forced to issue public statements defending the children's status as victims of a profound domestic deception. Neighbors who had walked past the garage for years expressed an acute sense of retroactive horror, realizing that the muted, unmemorable woman they had trusted to watch their own toddlers had been operating a private burial network just inches from their property lines. The final stage of the investigation involved a detailed psychological reconstruction of Huntsman's cognitive state during the active years of the offenses. State psychiatrists spent weeks evaluating her history, looking for indicators of severe postpartum depression, dissociative identity disorders, or secondary psychoses. The clinical findings, however, returned a far more calculated and chilling reality. Huntsman did not exhibit a lack of contact with reality. She possessed an acute, manipulative understanding of her environment. Her actions were defined by a highly structured form of maternal compartmentalization. She was entirely capable of providing baseline care, affection, and protection to her 3 older daughters because their existence was already legitimized within the community, while simultaneously treating her unborn infants as inanimate objects that had to be clinically discarded. The investigation concluded that her dependency on methamphetamine had not erased her agency. It had merely streamlined her capacity for absolute, cold-blooded utility, allowing her to systematically execute a decade of human life to preserve the silent, toxic equilibrium of her daily routine. The judicial conclusion of the state's case against Megan Huntsman moved from the investigative files to the 4th District Court in Provo, Utah, in early 2015. The physical setting of the court was defined by rigid wood paneling, heavy fluorescent lighting, and rows of silently packed benches filled with local residents and national media representatives. Huntsman entered the room wearing standard orange jail attire, her physical posture remaining as stooped and diminutive as it had been during her initial arrest. She waived her right to a full preliminary hearing, a strategic decision by the defense that prevented the public presentation of the most graphic forensic autopsy images, effectively fast-tracking the case directly to sentencing. In February 2015, Huntsman entered a surprise plea of guilty to 6 counts of first-degree felony murder. By pleading guilty, she avoided a prolonged capital trial where prosecutors had been openly weighing the pursuit of the death penalty. Her defense team attempted to introduce mitigating arguments, presenting clinical assessments that focused heavily on her decades-long severe chemical dependency. They argued that the persistent consumption of high-grade methamphetamine had fundamentally altered her cognitive wiring, creating a permanent state of emotional detachment and survival-driven panic that rendered her incapable of rational maternal decision-making. The prosecution countered this narrative by emphasizing the clinical, highly organized nature of the concealment. They asserted that her ability to systematically execute 6 separate life cycles, clear the biological traces from the home, and apply airtight packaging to the containers demonstrated a sophisticated level of situational awareness that completely contradicted the image of an out-of-control, chaotic drug addict. The surviving family members chose not to deliver extensive victim impact statements in open court, opting instead to submit private written letters to the bench to shield the 3 surviving daughters from further public media exposure. During the final sentencing hearing in April 2015, Judge Daryl McMcAfee addressed Huntsman directly, stating that the court had rarely encountered a scenario defined by such a complete and calculated abdication of basic human responsibility. He noted that while her addiction was severe, it could never serve as a legal or moral justification for a decade of systematic homicide. The court ordered the maximum penalty allowed under the plea agreement, 6 consecutive terms of 5 years to life in prison. In the state of Utah, this structural arrangement effectively guaranteed that Huntsman would spend the remainder of her natural life behind bars, as the State Board of Pardons would treat the consecutive nature of the sentences as a permanent barrier to parole. Huntsman was immediately remanded to the custody of the Utah State Prison in Draper, departing the courtroom without looking back at the gallery or offering a single public statement of remorse. The physical remnants of the house on East 200 South were eventually cleared, the structure sold, and the interior completely renovated, but the structural memory of the decade-long deception remained permanently embedded in the landscape of Pleasant Grove. The concrete floor of the garage, once a silent depository for 6 human lives, now sits empty, a sterile utility space indistinguishable from any other suburban carport. Huntsman remains isolated within the state correctional system, her existence completely reduced to an inmate identification number and the rigid, unchanging routine of a maximum security facility. The 6 mummified infants, who never received names, legal documentation, or public recognition during their brief existence, were eventually transferred to a quiet, unmarked plot in the local cemetery, buried in total silence, far away from the frantic chemical survival that had dictated their ends. The true legacy of the case is not found in the legal paperwork or the prison logs, but in the permanent emotional hollowing of the surviving daughters, who must navigate their adult lives knowing that the quiet woman who raised them had carefully filed their siblings away behind the family storage bins. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.